Welcome to my home. Thank you so much for coming over and talking with me. Today we're meeting with Tim Daniels. He's an attorney at law, and he's been doing adoption attorney. He's been working as an adoption attorney for 10 plus years. He graduated from BYU law school in 2004, and then you also worked as an active officer in JAG, right?
Yes, in the Air Force.
In the Air Force. And how was your time at BYU?
I loved it. Frankly, I wasn't married after I got a bachelor's degree, and so I got a master's degree, and I still wasn't married, and so I figured, well, I'll go get a law degree, and so I have my 3 degrees of glory from BYU.
That's awesome. I love that. And you kind of service all of Utah area, and you've been doing this attorney as an adoption attorney for the full 10 years?
For 10 years now, a little over 10 years, I've been doing a lot of adoptions. I started the Utah Adoption Law Center to kind of focus on adoption work.
Okay.
So
yeah. And you said you have a wife and 6 children?
Got a wife, 6 kids, and ranging from ages 17 to 2. And we've got 7 chickens.
One more chicken than kids, huh?
So, yep.
Yeah, my wife stopped counting. We don't count how many chickens we have anymore.
Okay.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about adoption. It can be a difficult process, and you know, sometimes it can be a little scary. So hopefully we can get through hopefully we can push through what's scary about adoption, and our friend Tim can help us to understand kind of the things that we need to know going into it, and also what we can do to make it easier on ourselves. So my wife and I have considered adoption multiple times as we have populated our family. We also have 6 children. They're all boys. And every single time we have a boy, we think about adopting a girl. And it just hasn't happened because we seem to hit, brick walls. We don't know where to go next. So hopefully you can help us understand, where maybe we've found some of those pitfalls and how to get over them.
Sure.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about what type of adoption you help out with?
So there's 3 main types of adoption. One, you've got foster child adoptions. And of course, the child is in state custody with these foster children. There's pros and cons to each of these types of adoption, but the pros and cons of foster care are that the state handles the termination of parental rights. And so that makes my job easier because that piece is already done. Another benefit for adopting a stepchild in Utah is that the state can reimburse you up to $2,000 for the legal costs. So the affordability of adopting a foster child. The fostering can be emotionally hard. I've never done it myself, but from what I gather, there's some ups and downs. Sometimes foster parents get bonded with a child or a baby, and then the parents do successfully get reunified with the child.
So the original birth parents get reunified.
Yeah.
So the parents who want to adopt, or maybe foster parents, they lose that opportunity.
Yeah, their hopes were high, and sometimes they'll even come to the adoption hearing because they love that child, but they'll that's if the child is being adopted by another foster family, I should say. Okay. Not if there's reunification. There is no adoption hearing if there's reunification.
Right.
So then another type of adoption that's very common is the step-parent adoption. And I'll just speak about that in terms of a stepfather adopting a stepchild, because typically it's the stepfather, even though stepmothers sometimes adopt as well. But for those cases, you still have to have termination of parental rights or consent. Probably the most common basis for a step-parent adoption is that usually again, it's the birth father. The birth father doesn't have much contact with the child. And after so many months and years, the child wants to be adopted by the step-parent, because that's their de facto parent. That's who the child identifies as dad. And so we'll file that type of a case as well. Then the third general type of adoption would be a private adoption. Those are interesting in that they can kind of come from different places. Like, for example, a young man and his wife struggle with fertility, for example, and their mom is at the gym one day exercising on a treadmill, and the lady next to her exercising has a daughter who's pregnant but can't raise the child for some reason. And they're talking and they make this connection that, hey, my daughter has a baby that she can't take care of, and your son and his wife have a desire to adopt. And so these connections can be made like that sometimes.
So sometimes they just happen organically, and then they come and they're looking to make this adoption happen.
And then the adopting parents and the birth mother, they start to communicate, whether by text or phone, and then they meet up, and sometimes it happens over social media. Sometimes it's a relative adoption where, my great niece is pregnant, or that type of thing. My cousin's nephew has a baby. That kind of these connections that can be made, and so the big thing there in those cases are we still have to have the consent of the birth parents, or have enough evidence to persuade the court to involuntarily terminate their parental rights. Okay. Of course, the consent is always
consent is the easiest route to go through, and probably the least expensive as well.
Yes, and the least emotionally taxing.
Yeah, that would be true.
Litigation isn't. I don't like litigation. Maybe there's some attorneys that thrive on litigation, but so there's the ambiguity of what's going to happen, and so a lot of cases end up settling in one way or another. The birth parents might say, well, I will agree, I'll consent to the adoption if you agree to every 3 months send me a newsletter about the child and with a picture. That way I can feel connected to my biological child.
And these agreements can be very tailored to each individual.
Yeah.
And each individual circumstance.
Yeah. So
how does the adoption agencies factor into these three types? You talked about the foster, the step parent adoption, and then the private party. Which one would an adoption agency fit in?
I guess that would be a fourth type, where an agency is involved and they facilitate. They're kind of like maybe a clearinghouse. They have birth mothers that contact them, and they have clients who want to adopt who contact them, and they are able to match up birth mothers with adopting parents. Some of the pros and cons. The pros are that you've got a pool of birth mothers who want to place their child with somebody, whereas with that private adoption where two grandparents are walking next to each other on treadmills,
it's a little more less likely to happen.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So perhaps we could say there's less waiting with adoption agency. Yeah. From what I can tell, adoption agencies charge a significant amount, so there might be an affordability issue.
Mm-hmm. So that could be kind of like the con is it's expensive. I know that when I was looking into adopting through an agency, I was seeing numbers around $40,000. That's a really hard pill to swallow.
My understanding is that even if a birth mother initially intends to place her baby through an agency, she can, after the birth, she can change her mind. Mm-hmm. And she has 24 hours after the birth before she can legally relinquish her rights or consent to adoption. And I've heard of cases where a birth mother does change her mind, and so.
And that's a good thing that she wants to keep the baby, but that can be emotionally difficult for maybe a family who was planning on adopting that baby.
And it's like that even for a private adoption, the two grandmothers on a treadmill type of thing, even then a birth mother still cannot legally relinquish her rights to the child until the baby is 24 hours old.
Okay.
For that situation, I tell my clients that they should almost insist that the birth mother see a counselor and that the adopting parents pay for it. One, there's a right to counseling under the Utah Adoption Act. But besides that, I just feel like having a counselor involved can help the birth mother, hopefully before the birth, solidify in her mind and heart whether she wants to go through and place the baby or whether she wants to try to raise the baby herself or, maybe with the help of her parents or something. Mm-hmm. But I feel like a counselor can be very valuable in that sense.
So with private adoptions, you would ask the adopting family to help with those costs. When it comes to foster adoption, does the state typically encourage them to seek counseling at their expense?
They're providing reunification services to a birth mother and hopefully a birth father too, right? Assuming they're married or perhaps not married. But they might have some type of requirement to have the parents go to counseling or receive other type of parenting classes and training and that type of stuff.
But their main purpose is to reunify that family.
That's their goal until either the birth parents decide to relinquish their rights or until the state has enough evidence to have their rights involuntarily terminated. And at that point, then the goal for DCFS changes from reunification to adoption.
Okay, so there is a shift that can happen if all those rights have been relinquished or taken.
Correct.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the different types of adoption. Let's talk a little bit about some of the steps that need to happen if we're going to go private party, because that's mostly what you deal with is private party adoption, correct?
I do all three of those.
You do handle all three.
I do the step parent, the foster parent, and the private adoptions. I don't do international adoptions.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk about that briefly.
Okay.
Those go through typically international adoption agencies, and those have to obviously comply with international law and the Hague Convention and doing some stuff with the State Department. So that's kind of a specialized area of adoption practice. But anyway.
Okay, so you don't do international, although that is an option. Is that typically a more expensive option, or is that a less expensive option if you adopt internationally?
I don't know about the costs of international adoption, but I think it's a longer process.
Okay, longer.
But yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. So the process, I'd like to talk a little bit about the process of the adoption of a child. And so to begin with, where would a family start if they were looking to adopt? Let's start from their point of view.
Let's talk a little bit about the home study. So under the Adoption Act, the legal term is a pre-placement adoptive evaluation.
Okay.
But in the adoption world, we call it a home study. And it involves background checks and interviews with the adopting couple or person. You don't have to be married to adopt, but you cannot be cohabitating. And so it includes the background checks and a visit, a home inspection, basically, to make sure that the home is a safe place to raise a child. It'll include some interviews and reference checks, that kind of stuff. So you have to have a home study through the foster care system. And also if there's a private adoption, then you have to have a home study. If it's a kinship placement, for example, if I want to place my child and to be adopted by my aunt or my uncle or my cousin, or oftentimes it's a grandparent, frankly, that is adopting a grandchild. In those kinship placements, a home study is not required.
Okay.
Also, in step-parent adoptions, a home study is not required because the birth mother lives in the home. She's raising the children, and the law presumes that she's got a nice, safe home for her kids. But in the private adoptions and in the foster care system, we do the pre-placement evaluation. Who does those? There's social workers that do those. How much do they cost? Roughly $800, maybe as cheap as $600 or as, up to $1,000, but somewhere in that area to get a home study done or the pre-placement adoptive evaluation.
Now, I heard that if you are in the foster system, like going to be a foster parent and looking to adopt, that the home study is covered by the state, those costs.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that'll be part of DCFS. They'll do the pre-placement adoptive evaluation of the home study.
Okay. I also heard that with the home study, if you go out and get your own home study done through like an independent social worker, and you pay for that, then you own that study and no one has access to that study except the people you want to have access to that study. Whereas if it's done through foster care, then the state has access to it. Is that correct? Or is it the state always have access?
I believe that's correct. I actually haven't run into that issue before.
Okay.
About who owns a home study. Yeah, in a private case, DCFS, they're not even aware of the private adoption.
Okay.
They're not involved. And then on the other hand, yeah, if it's a foster child, DCFS does have that home study report. If they have a copy of that, they'll give me a copy of it because I refer to that home study report when I create the petition for adoption of a foster child.
All right. So what's the next step? So if a family is interested in adopting, first they should seek out a home study and get that home study done. And then after that, what would be the next step?
If assuming it's a private adoption.
Okay.
So yeah, if it's get a home study, it's before the order, Eric, that I tell people is first of all, before I would spend maybe $1,000 getting a home study, I would see if there's a child out there. But it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing where, we want to have a home study done. That way, if we get word of a baby about to be born and they need to be placed right away, we've already got our home study done. But usually, like if somebody calls and they say, hey, there's a birth mother and she's 5 months pregnant. Maybe it's a relative, and if it's a close relative, then no home study is needed.
Right.
But maybe it's a neighbor's daughter or something, and then I would say, talk with her first before you invest in a home study.
Okay.
Talk with her a couple times, engage, get a sense of how committed she is to placing the baby for adoption, and if you feel comfortable, like, yeah, I think we have a good match here and she does want to place the baby with us, then I'd say, yeah, go get the home study and, incur that cost.
Okay. Because the home study, it does have an expiration date, doesn't it?
Yes. It's either 12 months or 18 months.
Okay.
And then there's a background check that's either 12 or 18. So, yes, home studies do have an expiration date. I think they last for 12 months, and then there needs to be a kind of an update.
Okay. How long do those typically take? Like if you did find someone who wanted to adopt out their baby, and how long, and they maybe have 3 months before the baby's born, or they're trying to look for someone as quick as possible because they already had the baby. Like how long would that home study take to kind of weigh that chicken and egg?
The initial home study?
Yeah.
I tell clients probably it's not going to be a couple days, but hopefully it's not as long as 3 months.
Okay,
probably
so less than 3 months.
Yeah, plan on probably a month or so to get that home study done. I should ask some friends who do home studies and say, hey, what's the average timing? From what I can tell, it's maybe 4 to 8 weeks.
All right. So first and second steps, kind of depending on what direction you're wanting to go, home study or identify a possible adoption that you're looking for. And then where would they go from there?
The next step is to figure out birth parents' rights. Are they going to consent? In a lot of cases, the birth mother does want to place the child, so we're going to get her consent. We can talk more about that. And then with the birth father, if they're assuming the birth mother's not married, then we find out if the birth father wants to assert his paternity rights. In Utah, an unmarried biological father has to jump through 4 hoops in order to successfully assert his paternity rights.
Okay.
He has to file a petition for paternity in Utah District Court. As part of that case, he needs to also file an affidavit agreeing to a court order of child support, because the court might not give him physical custody of the child, but if he wants to be a dad, he has to be willing to pay child support. The third hoop is the birth father needs to file notice of that paternity case in the Office of Utah Vital Records. And then the fourth hoop is the birth father needs to offer to pay and pay a reasonable share of the birth mother's maternity costs, the labor delivery costs, that type of thing. So the birth father or biological father has to do these 4 things prior to the time that the birth mother relinquishes her rights or consents to the adoption. And she can do that, and often does do that, 24 hours and 10 minutes after the baby is born. She has to wait 24 hours. So there's a window in which a birth father has to do all of this if he wants to successfully protect his constitutional parental rights to that child.
So if a child is already born to the birth mother and he hasn't put forth any effort, it would be a lot easier for her to put the child up for adoption.
Yes. And so what we'll do is we'll get a paternity search done, and vital records will show usually that no birth father has filed for paternity, and we give that to the court and say, court, the birth mother consents, and there's no birth father has asserted paternity, and then the judge is comfortable going forward with the adoption.
Would there be any complications if the birth father maybe wasn't informed that he was a birth father and then later finds out and he's like, wait a minute, I am interested?
That raises a great
Has that ever happened? Is it something you've ever seen?
Yes, yeah. So Section 102 of the Utah Adoption Act basically states that a biological father is on notice. He's presumed to be on notice that the birth mother may have a baby and that she might decide to place that baby for adoption. And so he's presumed to be on notice, and he has to take those affirmative steps. The Adoption Act also has a section about fraud, because would you believe it? Sometimes a birth mother tells her boyfriend that she's not pregnant, or that she already had the baby and the baby's gone, or she'll lie to a birth father. It actually happens, right?
Okay.
And so sometimes a birth father will call me and say, hey, she lied to me. I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry. Under the Utah Adoption Act, you can't undo the adoption. Fraud is not a basis for undoing an adoption. The Utah legislature really wants babies to be adopted preferably by a couple who've had a home study done, and preferably by kinship if possible, right? And so Utah law is pretty strict against unmarried biological fathers.
Okay. So they need to be on top of things and know what's happening.
If they
don't know, then they just haven't been very vigilant in their paternity responsibilities, is what the state sees it as.
They need to probably call an experienced family law attorney who knows those 4 hoops well, and who can help them jump through those hoops before that baby is born.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. So then after you know that the mother wants to put up the baby for adoption, you know that you have this plan in place and what those rights are and what the birth parents' rights are, what would be the next step?
There's a couple ways to go. And this is assuming that the baby hasn't been born yet. Okay. Then we can do a pre-birth petition for adoption.
Okay.
The baby doesn't have to be born when we file the adoption petition. So we can file the adoption petition, we'll get a case number and get a judge. And at this point, perhaps the mother is maybe 6 or 7 months pregnant. And then after we get that case number, then we can file a motion, a pre-birth motion for custody of that baby. So while a birth mother can't relinquish her parental rights until after the baby is at least 1 day old, she can agree that the adopting parents will have custody of that child from the moment of birth. And that way she can kind of go into labor and delivery knowing
She can have the assurances. She doesn't have to be worried.
Yeah, that the baby's not in limbo. These birth parents are going to have a court order of custody from the time of the child's birth. So that's one way to do it.
Does it also prevent her from maybe changing her mind to use a different family to adopt the baby? Or can she still change her mind about that? Because she can change her mind up to 24 hours about keeping the baby.
And after 24 hours, she doesn't have to consent then, but a lot of times they do. And especially with adoption agencies, they'll have a caseworker there at the hospital bed, right ready for the birth mother to sign the consent right at, again, 24 hours and 10 minutes, basically, from what I've seen. But yeah, a birth mother can withdraw that consent to custody.
Okay.
Of course, we have to give notice to the court and to the adopting parents. I haven't seen that in my career thus far, but legally she can withdraw that consent. And so with that, we get, she can consent outside of court. Maybe we should talk for a moment about consent of a birth mother and a birth father. So under the Utah law, a birth mother can only relinquish her parental rights and consent to adoption in the presence of a judge or in the presence of a court-appointed representative. In these pre-birth cases, I'll typically ask the court to appoint a social worker, typically as a court representative, and who can meet with the birth mother, establish a relationship with her, and if she wants to sign that consent to custody from the time of birth, she can do that with that social worker. Sometimes they don't want to do that. She doesn't want to consent to custody until after the baby is born, and then the social worker who was appointed by the court can meet with that birth mother, 24 hours after the birth or so, and accept her consent on behalf of the judge. On the other hand, a birth father, a biological father, he can consent to adoption just on a notarized paper, on a notarized document. He doesn't have to go to court. So that's one interesting difference between the mothers and the fathers.
Okay. Great. All right, I think we've gotten all the way up to the point where the baby's born and consent is given. What would be the next step? So it sounds like you need to appear before a judge.
So yes, the timing requirements, there's a residency requirement for foster child adoptions and private adoptions. The child needs to reside with the adopting parents for at least 3 months before the adoption can be finalized with a judge.
Okay.
For step-parent adoptions, the law is now 6 months that child needs to reside with the step-parent. The idea there, of course, is to make sure that there's enough time for a bond to form. Interesting, I've had a couple cases where the child has lived with de facto parents, like guardians, for example, for years, and then wants to be adopted. And I had to tell the parents, the adopting parents, that you have to have a home study done. And it was weird because I was like, why? We've had this child in our home for 14 years. Well, that's the law, but we can go to the judge and see if the judge will just kind of waive that requirement, even though that's not in the statute. So last year, I contacted my local Utah state representative, and the legislature just passed this bill saying that if the child has resided with the adopting parent for at least a year, then no home study is required. So that kind of saves those adopting parents a good chunk of money.
Yeah, if it was like a grandparent that the child was living in for that long, the home study wouldn't be necessary anyway because they're like so closely related.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
But in those cases where maybe they've been the de facto guardian for so long, and okay.
Another situation is if the child has lived with a man who her mother's boyfriend, who's really in a fatherly role to the child, and then the mother, heaven forbid, she dies. Well, it's not a step-parent adoption anymore.
Right.
Or maybe maybe the mother and the boyfriend were married, but then the mother dies. And so I would argue, hey, that's really a step-parent adoption, Your Honor,
right.
Even though the birth mother has passed. But sometimes the birth mother is not married, so they're not technically a stepchild. And so that new law covers that situation as well.
So we talked about a lot of the process, and you're very familiar with this process, and you can help families if they come to you, help them understand this process and help them get through this process. And that's clear that you have this expertise. But maybe you could expound a little bit on the ways as an attorney you will help adoptive parents in this process.
Got it. So I think perhaps the biggest thing that an adoption attorney can bring to the table is an assessment of how likely a court is to involuntarily terminate parental rights. That's the biggest thing. Obviously, it varies case by case. It's a very fact-intensive analysis. So I'm sounding like law school. It's a very fact-intensive analysis. And, we try to keep up on the recent cases coming out of the Utah Supreme Court or the Utah Court of Appeals to see how things are changing. In the olden days, 30 years ago, courts were, I call it almost trigger happy. It was very easy to terminate a birth father's rights. But now it's not that easy. We have to prove that it's strictly necessary, that a guardianship is not sufficient, or we have to prove that supervised visitation with the birth father is not sufficient. The rights have to be terminated in the eyes of the child. And so what type of situation is that true? Well, if there's been perhaps some sort of abuse or neglect, or where the child does not want to see the birth father, for example, or the birth parent, then in those situations, we might have a good chance of having that birth parent's rights involuntarily terminated. But simply being behind on child support, and maybe a birth parent has some troubles with alcohol or drugs, and maybe they go to jail for 90 days or something, that in itself is not enough to meet that high burden or high bar of strictly necessary to terminate the parental rights. So that's probably the biggest area where an adoption attorney can contribute. I would say that the next biggest area probably is the notice to the birth parent, working with either a process server or a constable. Sometimes if we can't, after doing a skip trace, we can't find where a birth parent is, then we'll do a motion with the court asking for alternative service. And that's kind of legalistic stuff where it's good to have an attorney involved.
Okay. And then when it comes to preparing, are there documents that need to be prepared to present before the judge that perhaps you help out with?
Yeah, so for a step-parent adoption, there's forms that you can get online and stuff. I can tell you that I'm sure some people successfully get through adopting a stepchild using the forms. On the other hand, I've had situations where clients start the process using the forms, but in my opinion, the form did not, it was not legally sufficient. And so I ended up filing an amended petition with more of the needed facts, and to feel, for me to be more comfortable that this was a stronger petition, I guess. We'll put it that way.
Okay. So the forms do exist out there if people want to try to do it on their own, but an attorney is going to help them through this process a lot smoother.
Yeah, and so then it becomes kind of a cost-benefit analysis of if you can afford the attorney, then probably go with the attorney because you'll have a better chance of avoiding legal mistakes. Again, the biggest mistakes are issues with notice. That due process that a birth parent has is important. So.
Yeah, and so you mentioned affordability. We did talk a little bit about some of the costs that make it disadvantageous to go through an agency to adopt a child. But how about we talk a little bit about affordability in the different methods that you were outlining? Because you talked about 4 different strategies for adopting if you're thinking about getting a child into your family. So let's talk about those 4 different methods in terms of their costs and affordability.
So sure. So again, the foster children, those their state reimburses you up to $2,000 per child, by the way. That's important, per child. So sometimes, a foster parent might adopt 3 or 4 children. And of course, there's really not, in the foster child adoption, since we don't have to terminate parental rights, suppose it's 3 children, I can't charge $6,000 for an attorney fee. There's just not that much legal work to be done, frankly. But there are economies of scale with adopting multiple children. But with the private adoption, in terms of the costs, I don't know if I've seen any through my office where the costs have exceeded like $5,000. That's if it's non-litigated. If it's litigated, then it depends on how much fighting goes on, how many depositions and subpoenas need to be issued, and all that type of stuff.
And when you say litigated, you're kind of talking about either a father or a mother who doesn't want to give up their parental rights.
Correct.
And then there's that litigation that's going on to either persuade them to give up or terminate.
Yeah. So the birth father or birth mother, they might have hired their own attorney. A lot of times they may be indigent, and so they'll qualify for a court-appointed attorney at taxpayer expense. Those cases can drag on. There can be appeals, of course, and there can be motions and hearings with the court. So those cases can be, I still don't think they're as expensive as a agency adoption. I mean, I've never seen a private adoption where the expenses were $40,000, but maybe they're out there. Then with an uncontested adoption, maybe we should talk about that.
Okay. With
an uncontested step-parent adoption, that a few $1,000s should suffice for that type of a case. It's, again, there's not a whole lot of legal work, especially if it's an abandonment case or the unmarried biological father never filed for paternity. Mm-hmm. Then we just get that paternity search done and get the birth mother's consent and go to the hearing.
Okay. And then there was one other type of adoption. We
haven't talked about ICPC yet.
Okay. Let's talk about that. What is ICPC?
So that's the Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children.
Okay.
And if a child, and this applies whether it's a DCFS foster child adoption or whether it's a private adoption. If a child is going to move states to be adopted, then we have to consider whether the ICPC requirements apply.
Okay.
The ICPC, kind of like the home study relative provision, you don't have to have a home study if a relative is adopting. Well, you have to, the ICPC has an exemption for relatives. If I'm going to adopt my my cousin, for example, from another state, then I don't have to comply with the ICPC. Otherwise, if it's a non-relative adoption, state to state, then here's what basically the ICPC requires. We have to have our home study done. We have to provide the ICPC office with proof that we have legal consent, whether it's through a court, guardianship, or some way to take care of this child, to have custody of the child. We have to file an affidavit that the child is not a Native American or Indian child, because there's also the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. We have various documents to provide to the Utah ICPC office, and then they'll coordinate with the other states' ICPC office, and to make sure that the two states can guarantee that the child is going to be well taken care of. So if the clients are in Utah and the child is born in Idaho, for example, then we'll file these papers with the Idaho ICPC office, and they want to review it before the child leaves their state. And they'll coordinate with the Utah ICPC office and to make sure that because since the clients live in Utah, the home study is done in Utah. And so the Utah ICPC office will review that home study, and then they'll tell the Idaho ICPC office, yep, this is a good placement, a safe placement for this child, this little citizen of Idaho, bring them on over here. And that in the years ago, ICPC kind of had a bad reputation, like it would take weeks to get this approved, or perhaps months, heaven forbid. Now, the two ICPC offices, their goal is to have it done within 3 days. So after that baby is born, we quickly file these papers with the ICPC office and get them to coordinate. And one case I had, it went to Utah, and then it went to California, and then back to Utah, all in like an afternoon. It was very quick. But we don't guarantee that, but
right.
that was a nice outcome.
It's definitely a lot more streamlined now than it was before. And it's not something you need to be afraid of, but definitely something you can help adoptive parents get through.
Yes, yeah. For ICPC, I can't imagine people doing that without an attorney, frankly.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that could be very complicated, working with all those legal firms in different states, especially with every state having its own requirements.
Yeah, frankly. So,
all right. I just wanted to really quick ask you success rate. I mean, when parents come and are asking you for help to adopt a child and they have already identified that child, what kind of success rate do you see these adoptive families having?
It all depends on the birth parent's parental rights. Are they going to consent? If they consent, then the success rate is pretty much 100%, right? But if the birth parents have concerns, or if we find out that the child may be an Indian child under the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, then that can interrupt the planned adoption, frankly. And because then the tribe needs to get notice, and we have to do some analysis of whether the ICWA does actually apply. Is there some way to get around ICWA? That kind of thing. But other than that, if the parents consent, then there's a good success rate. If the parents object to the adoption, then we've got to look at the facts of the situation and see what's in the best interest of the child and whether it's strictly necessary to terminate that parent's rights.
All right. Yeah. Well, I think we've talked a lot about this process, and I think we have a lot of information to take home and to digest. So thank you so much for meeting with us, Tim.
My pleasure.
And before we close, is there any last pieces of advice you'd like to give parents who are looking to adopt?
I'd probably say get information early on, and the background checks need to be done. We haven't talked about criminal history. Maybe we could talk about that for a moment.
Okay.
Under the Utah law, a background check needs to be done on each adult that lives in the home. And as we mentioned, an adopting parent cannot be cohabitating, but single parents can adopt in Utah. Sometimes people will call and have questions about their criminal history and whether their criminal history prevents them from adopting. There's a list of crimes that if you've been convicted of one of these crimes, like child abuse or child sex abuse or kidnapping, that type of stuff, then you can't adopt for a period of 10 years. There's a 10-year waiting period. And even after the 10 years, you have to jump through some hoops. You have to show that basically that you're safe, that you've been rehabilitated from that crime.
Okay.
So thankfully, most people don't have any of those convictions. So if somebody calls and they say, hey, I was convicted 5 years ago of shoplifting and I've had 2 DUIs, that's not going to prevent the adoption. The judge might have questions, but that's not going to prevent an adoption. The other background check that has to be done besides the criminal history check is a DCFS Child Abuse Central Registry check. And that one is free, it's quick. Utah DCFS is really fast at processing those. And if they'll send you a paper back saying, yes, you are in our database, or no, you're not. If you are in the database, then DCFS, we typically do a GRAMA request, a government records request, and to get the underlying records about why am I in the DCFS database. From what I recall, like I want to say 10 or 20%, it might be 20% of DCFS cases are substantiated, which would mean like
They have a reason for being there.
80% are not substantiated.
Oh my goodness.
So just being in the DCFS database, having your name mentioned in the database somewhere, certainly doesn't mean you can't adopt. The statute doesn't mention the DCFS being mentioned stops you from adopting. The statute mentions that list of crimes, bad crimes.
It's more of like a red flag. You have to look in a little deeper and see if there's something that's actually keeping you from adopting. And if your name is just on the list, but it doesn't really have a substantiated reason, then you're in the clear.
Correct. Yeah. It's something that the judge might have some questions about, but it's, I don't believe I've ever seen anybody not be allowed to be adopted because just they were in the list, or because there might even be a substantiated DCFS case, but if it's not one of those 10 enumerated crimes, the judge still has discretion to say, yeah, stepfather, you maybe had a domestic violence incident 5 years ago and you're mentioned in the DCFS database, but the child loves you. You're really the child's de facto father. And the birth mother, your wife, wants you to adopt the child, right? And the judge is going to approve that adoption.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for being here and giving us all this wonderful advice and helping us understand this process of adopting a child. It can be an intense process, and it can be overwhelming at times. And I've tried to go through this process a few times myself, so I know how overwhelming it can be. It's really great to have someone who knows what they're doing be part of that process. And so thank you for helping us out.
The adoptions are the happy cases. Judges routinely tell my clients, thanks for coming here today, because most of my day is filled with very sad or disturbing situations. And so the judge is happy to do an adoption because it's the happy case that the judge gets to deal with.
So go in ready to put the smile on the judge's face. Don't be worried about the judge.
Yeah,
he wants it to be happy.
The vast majority of judges are just amazing, wonderful people. And thankfully that's how it should be, of course. And they love the adoption cases.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for being here. Have a great day.
All righty. Thank you.